Well, good morning, Meadowbrook. How are we doing this morning? It is so good to see you this morning. Special welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We are so glad that you are with us. So Becky and I had been married for just a couple of years. We were living in Atlanta. We were 1 year out of grad school, which meant I was 1 year into pastoring. And when we were in Atlanta, the first couple of years, we had no kids. I was a youth pastor at this church, so it wasn't all that uncommon for us to get asked to house sit for people when they were on vacation. And so we were house sitting for this one couple, an older couple. They had this beautiful home, and we found ourselves sitting in their living room asking the question, like, so how do we buy a house? Like, how does that happen? I mean, we're married now, we're out of school, we both have jobs. That's probably like the next step in life, isn't it? Shouldn't we just think about that? So we're having this conversation, and we say maybe we should just start looking. Not that we're actually in a position to buy a home, but we should just start looking because that's how we're going to educate ourselves. And so my wife, being the Google researcher that she is, she just starts Googling houses in our area, and she came across this house. And she pulled this house up, and she's like, hey, let's go look at this house. It's not that far away. It seems relatively affordable. And on the website, it had this little box, this little message box where it says, if you're interested in seeing this house, fill out this box, and somebody will contact you. So we do that, and we don't know who it's going to. It's just going to somebody. And we get this phone call later that day from this individual, and he's like, hey, you can come see this house this weekend. We're like, yeah, let's go do that. And so the plan was on Saturday, we were going to go look at this house for 20 minutes or so, ask a few questions, get to know a realtor, start building a relationship, and then finish out our day and go do our errands and whatever. So Saturday rolls around. We go look at this house. We walk in, and instantly we fall in love. I mean, we're like, oh, this house is perfect. You walk in and it had this big living room that opened up into a kitchen and dining room, which opened up into a back living room. And the house, you can kind of see in the picture, was on a hill, and the ground keeps going down below the back of the house. And it was all windows in the back of the house, so it kind of felt like you were in a tree house, because once you got to the back of the house, it dropped down even further, and it was just like, oh, this house is amazing. So we start talking to the realtor, and he starts saying, yo, you guys are first-time home buyers. There's credits for first-time home buyers. There's this program for first-time home buyers where no money down you can have, you can get a house. And we're like, what? And so we thought we were going to spend 20 minutes there. 2 hours later, we're talking to this guy and creating a plan for the next day to go look at comps, to look at other houses. And then for the following week, to set up a meeting with a mortgage broker, then to ultimately put in an offer. And so that all happened within the span of 2 weeks. Now, this was September and October 2008. So right? Right? So we move into this house, and in the middle of October, just through the roof, that we have a house, it's amazing. And then before that year's over, the bottom falls out. People are talking about recession, the market is just tanking. And as first-time home buyers in our mid-20s, I don't really know what that means. I'm sure we're fine. 2009 rolls around, and we get our tax statement for that year. And that's where I was really faced with the reality of what happened. I opened up our tax statement. We had bought the house at $170,000. The value listed on our house in that tax statement was $101,000. I was like, oh, what does that mean? What do we do? And each year when the tax statement came around, I would open up to glance at the taxes, but I wouldn't look at the value of our house because I just couldn't stomach it. And so I wonder if anybody here has ever had a situation like that, right? Where you've had a situation where your financial situation didn't go as planned. I remember looking at that tax statement for the first time and remembering sitting with a mortgage broker in Starbucks, and he said, buying a house is the best investment you will ever make. And I looked at it, I'm like, really? Is it really? But we've probably all been there. If you lived enough of life, you've been in financial situations where your financial situation didn't go as planned. Maybe you suddenly, unexpectedly lost a job and you're without work for months and you're thinking, how are we going to make this work? Or maybe you're trying to be diligent to save, and as you do, it seems like every time you're just getting ahead, you're hit with some unexpected major expense, and you're like, oh, we just can't get ahead. And when you hit those moments, usually what happens is something we call the scarcity mindset. Usually you slip into this way of thinking where you're like, there's not enough to go around. You focus on what you lack and what you don't have, and you have this internal drive, this motivation of, I have got to get more. It's like your sole focus in life easily becomes, I've got to get more, because the belief is if I have more, if I can store more, if I can save more, then everything will be fine. And so the belief that we develop is that more is always better. I don't know if you remember, AT&T had a series of commercials about 7-8 years ago where it was this guy sitting around a table of little kids, and they're just always talking about what would be better. And the slogan for this ad campaign is more is better. The implication being more is better than less. And it can easily be in our own thinking that more is always better. But the question is that true? Is more always better? Like, we're living in one of those times where people are talking about recession, cost of living is going up, and it's easy for us to be in that place to think, I've just got to get more. But is it true that more is always better? Our passage today addresses that question, and it starts with Jesus teaching a large crowd. This is what we read in Luke 12, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, again, this context is Jesus teaching a large crowd, and we're told earlier in Luke 12 that it's a crowd of many thousands of people. And somewhere in this crowd, one individual emerges, and he's asking Jesus to settle a family dispute between he and his brother. And it might seem weird that this guy would break through a crowd of a few thousand and ask Jesus this question to settle a family dispute, because Jesus was a rabbi and a teacher and not a judge. And Jesus even acknowledges that. In verse 14, he says, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Now, even though it seems weird that maybe this guy would be bringing a request like this to Jesus, and Jesus even acknowledges maybe that's a little weird, in actuality, it was quite normal for an individual to bring a situation like this before a rabbi. Because in ancient Judaism, civil law and religious law were all intertwined. There was no civil court system. See, in our system, in our culture, there's a very clear dividing line between religious and civil. We say what? There's a separation between church and state. In ancient Judaism, there was no separation. The civil law, the religious law were all intertwined, and rabbis, teachers of the law, were the experts in the law, and so it wasn't unusual for people to bring situations like this to a rabbi for them to help sort it out. And it appears what this guy's after here is justice. He wants justice to happen. And God is a God of justice. Jesus is all about justice. So it would be natural for this guy to bring a situation like this to Jesus, hoping that he might sort it out. So it's not so much that his request is weird. It's actually that Jesus' response in verse 14, "Who made me judge or an arbiter between the two of you?" is kind of weird. But Jesus seems to discern that justice really isn't the thing that's motivating this guy. It's not really justice that he's after, but it's something else. Because in verse 15, Jesus says this, "Then he said to them, 'Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions.'" See, it appears that this guy is driven by greed more than justice. And in Jesus' fashion, the next thing he does is he tells this guy and everybody else there a story. And the story he tells them is this, verse 16. Then he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store up my surplus grain. And then I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. So Jesus, in response to this guy's request, tells this story, a story of a fairly successful farmer. Now, in an agrarian society like first century Judaism, no question that there would be farmers and a crowd of many thousands listening to Jesus. And I'm sure those farmers are like, I would love to be that guy. I would love to be that guy, to be that successful, to have that much surplus, to have more than you need for years to come. That would be amazing. But as Jesus continues to teach this parable, he says in verse 20, but God said to him, you fool. Now, again, if I'm a farmer and I'm listening to this story and I'm excited about being the farmer who's the main character of the story, and then I hear Jesus call this guy a fool, I'd be like, whoa. Like, wait, why is that the case? Because in order to have a surplus of grain, like that doesn't happen by accident. You have to be hardworking. You have to be diligent. You have to be disciplined. And in the Old Testament, there's all kinds of places where it says hard work is good. You find it in the Proverbs, like Proverbs 12:11. Those who work the land will have abundant food, but those who chase fantasies have no sense, right? The Old Testament, specifically the Proverbs, are said to be wisdom literature. There's wisdom in the Proverbs. So if this guy in this story has an abundance because he's worked hard, like he should be called wise, not a fool. And the logical conclusion is this: if you're successful, if you have lots of grain, you've got to put it somewhere. And if you don't have enough space in your current barns, you might as well build bigger barns. And then he wants to celebrate his success. He wants to take an extended vacation and say, yeah, I've worked hard. What is the big deal? What's wrong with that? If I'm a farmer listening to Jesus tell this story, all of those thoughts would be going through my mind. But then Jesus makes his point with his story. And the point he's trying to make is this. Continuing on in verse 20, he says, this is why, you fool, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. See, what Jesus is saying here isn't so much that it's wrong to have an abundance. I mean, at some level, for the farmer in this parable, granted it's a parable, but at some level, for the farmer in the parable, having an abundance is outside of his control. When you're trying to grow things, there's all sorts of things that are outside of your control. Because there's many people back in the ancient world who would have had many of years where they worked hard, they worked diligently, they did all the right things, but because of the conditions that they can't control, they didn't have a great year. There's all sorts of things that you can't control. So it's not bad to have an abundance. It's not wrong to even build bigger barns. For the guy coming to Jesus wanting his share of his inheritance, that's not a bad thing to want either. But what Jesus is doing with this parable in this moment is he's demonstrating that when we have a focus, an overemphasized focus on ourself, we miss the bigger kingdom picture. Because I don't know if you caught it in the story that Jesus tells, but there's this repetition of the word my. You see in verse 17, he says, oh, I have no place to store my crops. Verse 18, I will tear down my barns. There I will store my surplus of grain. And I will say in verse 19 to myself. Jesus is highlighting that it's really easy for us to have an overemphasized vision of life in terms of myself. And this is innate in us. I mean, it's like hardwired into us. We don't have to try hard to have a focused vision and version of life that revolves around us. You see it instantly when kids are born. I remember when Kate was just around 2. We had some friends come over to the house. I mean, she was like the cutest 2-year-old, right? Not that she isn't cute now, but the cutest 2-year-old. We have friends come over who have kids around her age, and there's no way that we taught this to her. Well, who knows? Maybe we did. Maybe we did actually teach this to her. But we have friends come over, and we had this playroom in our house, and we say to the parents of this kid, hey, Kate, why don't you take so-and-so to go play in the playroom? And she doesn't engage with the kid. She just runs to the playroom saying, my toys, my toys, my toys, right? Like, she doesn't want to share the toys, right? At 2, she has this vision of this is my life. These are my things. You can't have them. And when you cultivate a belief that what I have is mine, I've worked for it, I've earned it, I've done what I needed to do, we also lose sight that everything we have actually belongs to God. I mean, this is the other thing I'm telling my kids right now. When they have their rooms and they're wanting to go into their rooms and they're trying to, I'm like, do you know whose room that is? They're like, it's my room. I'm like, no, it is my room. It's on loan to you. I can make you stay on the couch if you want, right? This is my room, right? Same is true with us and God. It says in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's. Anybody here live on earth, right? The earth is the Lord's. And what? Everything in it. It all belongs to him. I mean, for he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. It's all his. Everything that we have actually belongs to him. It's on loan to us. And for those who are followers of Jesus, the call of what we have is to steward our stuff so that we can bring glory to him, we can serve the world, and we can live in a way that we can trust and have confidence that we will have everything we need. And the danger of losing sight of that is that greed and selfishness starts to creep in to your heart. One of the best quotes that I have ever come across on greed is from Tim Keller. He says, the Bible talks about money 20 to 30 times more than it talks about sex. Why? Because money's spiritual power blinds us to itself. When people are committing adultery, they know they are doing it. But hardly anyone who loves money too much knows they do. People are always confessing sexual sins and all kinds of other sins, but almost no one thinks I'm materialistic or greedy. But if A, the Bible continually warns us about the danger of materialism, yet B, almost no one thinks they are guilty of it, then C, it means a great number of people are blinded to and by the power of money in their lives. The only responsible thing to do is to go on the working hypothesis that we are all infected by materialism and greed and must be on watch for it. If materialism is this insidious and stupefying, it's a lot like alcoholism. Maybe the best sign of materialism is this: you aren't even willing to admit that you have a problem. You aren't even willing to admit that you are enslaved to money and greed. That for me is so stinging, because it's there in my heart all the time. All the time. As we're going through this campaign, I've mentioned before that God invited us, our family, to significantly increase our giving over the next couple of years. And part of the reason why that was hard for me to swallow, I desperately want a new car. So bad. Well, if you've seen my car, I'm ready to drive that thing off a stinking cliff, right? It is so old, it feels like it's falling apart. But I'm like, maybe I just need to sit with this car for a little bit longer. And maybe that's okay. And we're in a situation right now where we would have the margin to go get a new car. But maybe it's okay that I sit with this car that I don't want, because it's going to teach me so many other things. Because besides greed, this desire for more creates in us these three things. It gives us a false sense of, one, significance. Like we live in a world that says important people, powerful people, significant people have more. So if I can get more, maybe that means I'm significant. It also gives us a false sense of self-sufficiency, of like, oh yeah, I did this, I made it, I am the master of my own destiny. And then it also gives us a false sense of security, that if I can get more, I can insulate myself and nothing bad will happen. But what God is continually trying to shape in us is a true sense of humility. That it's not about how important you are, but it's about, two, your dependency on Him. He's trying to create in us a true sense of humility, a true sense of dependency, and then lastly, a sense of security, not in our stuff or our bank account, but in Him. That's what He wants to shape in us. He could care less about what we have. He wants us to be a certain type of person that views life in a certain type of way. And so the way that we guard against greed and selfishness in our lives is through giving. It's that simple. We guard against greed through giving. The more that we are able to be generous and give away, it's a preventer of greed and selfishness forming in our lives. As we have moved through this series each week, we are sharing you testimonials and videos of people whose lives have been impacted by our church and who are wrestling through this idea of giving. And so we wanted to show another one to you. We're going to introduce to you a couple named Sal and Mickey through this video. So go ahead and turn your attention to the screen.
I'm Sal Kalura. This is my wife, Mickey, and we have been attending Meadowbrook for 5 years. When we moved back to Tosa 11 years ago, we knew that Meadowbrook existed. And at the time we were attending Elmbrook, we were asked to facilitate a Faith Foundations class. And it was after a couple semesters of that had ended that we decided to come to Meadowbrook and get closer to where we lived.
One of the things I really love about Meadowbrook is the family feel that's here. We've been at large churches, small churches. I just really love the teaching. I love the depth that's here. We have 3 grandchildren that attend here, along with our daughter and son-in-law, and it's been really fun to see them here and share that Sunday morning experience with them, as well as the 4-year-old in particular, her excitement about going to Sunday school. She loves to come to Sunday school. She comes up always really excited after being in class. What excites me about knowing that Meadowbrook is going to continue to expand kids' ministries. I love that they minister to all ages, from little all the way up to teenagers. I think that's really important because those are such foundational years for kids, and to give them a good foundation in the Word of God, and the fact for them to really understand that God has a plan for their life and He loves them and He wants to be part of their life. For me, growing up, I did have that, and it made all the difference in the world for me. I still made a lot of mistakes in my life, but to have that solid foundation was huge for me, and that really excites me that Meadowbrook has that as a priority as well.
As grandparents, we're praying for our grandchildren. We're praying that they would find their identity in Christ at a young age, that they wouldn't be influenced so much by the world and the isms that are out there, and to know that that foundation is being poured into them in Sunday school here is a blessing to our hearts. It's huge in our lives because they're reinforcing what we are praying about. Generosity means to me that I'm returning a blessing that I've received. By nature, I'm a selfish guy, and I think we all have learned that human nature is selfish, and it's really getting your eyes off of yourself and onto the Lord and His kingdom and what he wants to accomplish through his kingdom. And as I've grown and I've understood that this blessing and these blessings given to me by grace and his mercy is really for me to give out, not to hoard, not to hold tightly, but to hold loosely. Because I think when the dust settles and our life is over, we're not gonna be wondering, what do I have? It's what have I given? What have I done for the kingdom? And it's not out of guilt. It's out of wanting to, again, advance the kingdom and be appreciative of the blessing and the love and the forgiveness and all of what's entitled and encased in being called and being chosen by the Lord. It is extremely humbling.
So I think a better attitude to have about giving is to not give begrudgingly, but give joyfully. So often they say, give till it hurts. Don't give till it hurts. Give till there's joy. Because when we partner with God to give and be generous, it should be a fun, exciting, joyful experience. We shouldn't think of it as sacrificing so much. We're being obedient to God. And if we're giving generously, we're also giving faithfully. And that's honoring God.
I've played sports in my life, and a lot of times a team will reflect the attitude and character of a coach. Mm-hmm. And Bryan does that for us here in regards to, we definitely catch his drift and where his heart's at for people and for advancing the kingdom of God. And it doesn't get better than that, because we're all called to love God and to love people.
I really appreciated what they said around one, when we come to the end of our life, it's not going to be so much of like what we have, because the reality is like we can't take that with us. But it will be a reflection on like, how did I use my life? How did I steward my life? Did I make the most of this life when it comes to advancing the kingdom? And sometimes we have this mindset of I have to give out of obligation. And we call people to give until it hurts. But what about if we were to flip that and we were to say, man, I give until I experience joy, trusting that joy comes as I pour out my life for the Lord. You know, as we near the end of this Forward series we have this week and next, we have been holding in front of you the need of our church to rethink and reconfigure our space. And this series concludes next Sunday, and it concludes with what we're calling Commitment Sunday. Because hopefully somewhere along the way, you've been able to pick up a commitment card. One's been handed to you as you leave. And we're asking you next Sunday to come, having prayed through what God might be inviting you to give towards this initiative. And so next week, we kind of put the period behind it. We've already had roughly 30 people make commitments, 30 households make commitments over the last couple weeks, which has been exciting to see that people understand the need for this, the desire to help and see it happen. And we're asking you to come next Sunday ready to say, yes, God, I want to take a step of faith. It might seem scary. It might seem uncertain for you, but it's going to help us as a church have a firmly rooted gospel legacy in this community for generations to come, to extend what God has been doing in our lives to the community around us. Now, I imagine that many of us might be saying internally, yeah, but Bryan, you don't know where I'm at in life. Like you don't know what's going on in my life. You don't know the things that I'm wrestling through, the things that are weighing on me. And the truth is, for some of you, you're right. I don't. I don't know what's weighing on you, but I do know that God does. And I do know that God invites us into things in a way where we can cultivate humility, dependency, and a sense of security in Him. And that's why Jesus, in this moment, after he tells this parable, he finishes this teaching around the topic of worry, which he says this in verse 22. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, or what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes." And then he goes on to say, look at the ravens. Look at the birds of the air. Notice how God continually provides for them. And then he says, look at the flowers of the field. Not even Solomon, King Solomon, who's one of the wealthiest men in the Old Testament, was dressed in the splendor like the flowers of the field. If God cares for the birds of the air and the flowers of the field like that, how much more will he care for you? Because you are more precious to him than the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. Now, I'm not saying be foolish and be like, I'm just going to give it all, go home and empty my bank account and bring it to the church. We're not asking you to be foolish. We're asking you to do business with God and see what God might invite you to give. And at the end of the day, that's all we want. We want you to engage with God, to hear from him and be obedient. Even if it feels scary, even if it feels risky, even if it feels like I'm stepping out on a limb, because in those moments, God meets you and provides for you and gives you everything you need. That's why he goes on to say in verse 29, do not set your hearts on what you will eat or drink, and don't worry about it. For the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be so also. There's a real interesting contrast in what Jesus does in the parable and then what he says at the end. Because in the parable, the farmer of the parable is all about building bigger barns. I need bigger barns. But near the end, Jesus says, provide for yourself purses that won't wear out. A huge difference in size between a barn and a purse. He's saying, trust that God will give you everything you need. And the reason why I feel like I can speak so boldly on this, I've seen it firsthand in my own life. Like go back to the house, right? The house where we lost all kinds of money in. We bought that house when we didn't have kids, didn't have a dog. Somewhere along the way, a dog and 3 kids later, we looked at this house and we're like, man, we just need something different for our growing family. So this would have been 2015, right? Almost 7 years since the market crashed. We worked with a realtor, we did comps. We found that we could sell that house for $152,000. Means we lost all our equity in the house. When it came to the day of the sale, we actually sold the house for $152,000. We owed $153,000. If you do the math, that means we had to sell our house and pay $1,000. Now, the week we put our house on the market, there's lots of pockets of Atlanta that are still on septic system, we found out that our septic system had failed. We had it cleaned out, it was serviced. Here's how I figured out that it failed. I went out to look at the septic system after they had cleaned it a day later, just kind of check it out, walk around. I mean, it's all underground. I don't know what I was looking for, but I was just going to go check it out. But I walk out, and there's a hole in my backyard, and I'm looking at what's in this hole. I'm like, I think I'm staring into my septic system, which means it was this old concrete thing. The bottom had fallen. It was starting to crumble. So we had to replace our whole septic system. Do you know how much septic systems cost? I didn't either until that time. $15,000. Because it wasn't just the tank, it was the whole system, everything. It was 50 years old or whatever. So we lost all the equity in our house. We then had to drain our savings to pay for the septic system. And you know what? We always had everything we needed and more. And God invited us in that season to keep giving, to keep tithing, to keep providing the church with what it needed. And we always had what we needed and more. Like, I'm a testament to say God is faithful to his people. And again, we're not trying to twist your arm. We're just asking you to take a step of faith and trust that he will provide everything that you need. And as we take this step of faith as a church, we get to experience his power, like we talked about last week, his grace, his power at work in our lives, not just to build a new building, but to bring more people to Jesus, to see the life-transforming power that we have experienced extend to the people around us. So we'd love to have you move forward with us as we journey with God to reach this neighborhood and the world with his gospel for his glory. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much for what you have done in our lives. Lord, I thank you so much for how you have taught me over time what it means to faithfully follow you, even in situations where it feels like it doesn't make sense. And so, Lord, I'm asking this morning that you would speak to our church, individually and collectively, that you would help us see who you are, how you're working, and that what it is you have for our church to root us here, to reach this community and beyond. May we get excited about that. May we get excited about bringing our friends, our families, and our neighbors to you to see their lives transformed in the same way that you've transformed ours. We pray this in your name. Amen.